Dr. Krannawitter, thank you so much for being with us today. We'd love to ask if you'll just give us a few opening comments on our topic, which is the systems of checks and balances and justice, and we'll go from there.
All right. Thank you, Kathy, very much. And thank you, everyone else, for joining today. The subject of checks and balances might kind of sound boring at first, and yet underneath it is something fascinating. It's really a study of human nature that's driving this whole subject. So when we talk about checks and balances, we mean things like the fact that the president in the Constitution, the president has the power to veto a piece of legislation, the fact that the Supreme Court can declare a piece of legislation unconstitutional. The legislative branch, Congress, has the power to impeach really any officer of the federal government. And so in this way, the branches can check each other. Now, I'm going to suggest here in a few minutes, there are a number of other checks and balances that we typically don't talk about. And I want to give you kind of a bigger context why this matters. The whole notion of checks and balances is part of a bigger subject that the authors of the Federalist Papers, I always keep my handy copy, someplace close to me, called the separation of powers. And let's make clear here what they meant by powers. They define it in the Federalist Papers. There are three kinds of political powers. There's the legislative power, which is the power of making law. There's the executive power, which is the power of enforcing or executing the law. And there's the judicial power, which is the power to render judgment, to sit in judgment when there are allegations or accusations that the law has been broken. And just from looking at those three basic political powers, it should be clear that within our constitutional system, the legislative branch, in a decisive way, is the most important. It is the central. The other two branches are basically functionaries of the legislative branch. When you think about, right, what does the executive branch execute? What does it enforce? And the answer is it enforces the laws. And the judicial branch, what does it judge? It judges the laws or allegations of violations of the laws. In other words, their work revolves around the law, and so that the source of the law is really important, the legislative branch, Congress. There are at least three reasons that the founders gave us for separating powers and really arming each branch with certain checks over the other. The first is, in a way, the simplest, and that is each of these three powers requires a very different kind of art, a very different kind of skill, a different kind of knowledge. The art of legislation requires tremendous deliberation, consideration of all kinds of variables and details. You want a large legislative branch representing many different points of view, many different interests in the making of law, because the making of law applies to everybody. That is, if it's good and just, to build on our theme here, if it's just law, it should apply to everyone. The arts required to go enforce that law often require decisive action, quickness, the ability to be nimble in difficult situations. That's a different kind of skill set than the art of writing laws. And then finally, the judicial power, it too requires a very different kind of art, a different kind of skill set, different kinds of virtues, right? To sit in judgment and judge the laws and accusations or allegations that there have been violations of the law. So this is one reason we want to separate the three powers so that those who exercise each power are more likely to do their job well, to exercise that power well. The second is a lesson that's really at the heart of the American Revolution, and that is government is both necessary and very dangerous. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the founders of the United States viewed government as something similar to fire. It's important, it's necessary. We need fire, and at the same time, government is both necessary and very dangerous. And I would encourage those of you who are not familiar with the Federalist Papers, take a look at three of them in particular, numbers 47, 48, and 49. They really do form a kind of little mini trilogy in the middle of the Federalist Papers, all on the subject of separation of powers and checks and balances. And in number 47, Madison says, the accumulation of all three powers, that is, the power to make law, the power to enforce it, and the power to adjudicate challenges to the law. If you put all three powers in one set of hands, whether it's the hands of one person or one group or one committee, one cabal of people, he says that's the very definition of tyranny, right? Because if I'm the government and my laws apply to you, and I have the power to make the law, I have the power to enforce the law and make sure that you're obeying my law. And if there's an accusation that you've broken my law, I am the one to sit in judgment whether you broke the law or not. That is a recipe for tyranny. That's why we want to separate these powers. And in number 48, Madison says what a constitution is basically it's a kind of parchment barrier. It's using pieces of paper, right? We're writing on paper, we're writing on parchment to keep the branches separate. But he says we need something else besides or in addition to mere parchment barriers. And that's why we need checks and balances. We need to actually equip each branch with real tools that can be used to keep the other branches in line when they do things they're not supposed to do, exercise powers that they're not supposed to exercise. So that's the second reason for checks and balances and separation of powers. Government's dangerous. It's necessary and it's dangerous. And the third reason is really articulated in Federalist number 49, which I consider to be the peak, the theoretical peak of that book, which is we want not merely limited government or constitutional government. I mean, we want those. We want our government to be a constitutional government, which means it has only the powers. It's limited in its powers to the powers we, the people, have given to our government. But we want something more. We want good government. We want just government. We want justice. And justice requires, at a minimum, the equal protection of the equal rights of each and every citizen who lives under this government. And what we find in number 49, Federalist number 49, is this wonderful discussion of comparing government to the classical philosophic model of a virtuous, self-governing human being, which is a human being in which reason rules over the passions and the appetites. That's self-government according to Aristotle. And in number 49, Madison says, our goal in designing this government the way we did and separating these powers, now remember, the power is separated not merely among the three branches, but also vertically between the national government and state government. That's another important separation of power, and the people themselves. And he says our aim, he doesn't say this is a guarantee we're going to get it. It's just our goal in designing it this way is for the reason of the public to rule over the government through our Constitution, and the government to rule over the passions and appetites of the public. For example, with criminal law, right? Criminal law is meant to deter us from acting on our impulses and appetites and passions. And that really boils down to reason ruling over passion, which is the central theme of classical philosophy. And this is why we want to adopt a wise and good constitution. We actually want good government. And if that doesn't work, the founders reminded us all the time, remember, our country was born out of revolution. Among the checks on our government, the things we mentioned before, the veto power, impeachment power, all of those things are important checks on the government. The fact that most power is reserved to states and the national government only has a few powers that we, the people, enumerated and delegated to the national government. That's another check. The founders always reminded us the most important check of all is the right of revolution. And it's an awesome, terrible check. It's one that we hope we never have to exercise again, because once you open up revolution, it's hard to know. You know, a great contrast is to look at our own American Revolution and contrast it with the French Revolution, which went in a very different way. And then they had a really difficult time stopping that revolution, right? They couldn't bring it. Anytime someone wanted to stand up and say, okay, right, we've killed off the king and the royal family here in France, and let's have some law and order now, the revolutionaries would turn on those people, go chop their heads off. They couldn't stop that. And so the founders' point is revolution sometimes is necessary. It's necessary for justice, and it is the ultimate check on government, and it's a check that we don't want to use, which is why we want to build in what Madison called auxiliary precautions, these other kinds of checks and balances, like the veto power and impeachment power and judicial review on the part of the Supreme Court, to try to use the interests of each branch to keep the other branches in line where they're supposed to be. If we can do that, they said, we'll have something approximating a good and just government. And I would put out here, maybe this is something we can talk about. We've been striving for that for over 200 years, and it's a real question whether we've actually ever achieved that or not.
Well, thank you for those opening comments. And I can definitely tell why you were, as Jill tells us, you're one of the favorite instructors at the leadership program of the Rockies. I was just really got a lot out of that. And I know we've got a lot of questions lined up. So Janine, I'm going to go to you.
Hello. Yes, that was a terrific overview. It was so thorough. I'm trying to think, what questions do I have? Because it was so thorough. You know, I've been struck with watching, how can I put this? You know, when we're dealing with foreign dignitaries, I think the comfort that I have, and I think that Republicans can have comfort, and Democrats can have comfort, and independents can have comfort, is that we don't put all of our eggs in one basket. In other words, there may be one representative going abroad, but that one representative, all the power isn't in that person in our country. And that they can falter or fail no matter over the decades or which president it might be or which party it may be. But in a way, even if it's on an international stage, we were able to realize, and our enemies realize, that, well, this person's here, but there are a lot of people in the government in America that are going to make decisions, and it's not all in the hands of this one person. So I really find that to be intriguing, which kind of falls in line with tyranny. I think that our checks and balances really prevent tyranny and putting everything in the hands of one person or in the few. So I want everyone to have time for the questions. I really just sort of have one, and that is, you know, the checks and balances are incredibly thorough, but something that they didn't think about was the party system.
Yeah.
Because the checks and balances, in my opinion, really work if people are striving for justice and reason and logic, not just dogma and power. Yeah. And it's kind of like law. You know, if you're a lawyer, you're really not looking for justice as much as you're looking for that person to win. You know what I mean? You're representing, your job is to represent that person and to win for that person. justice comes from more of a philosophical bent. But talk to me about the party system and the kind of tendency we have in our country right now in regard to justice to just want to win.
Yeah.
And then we lose that whole sense of justice and reason and logic, and people need to have a conscience, because I think we've had a conscience. We haven't always lived up to it, but if we lose that sense of conscience and go complete dogma party, then we've lost,
Yeah.
I think, our sense of justice.
Well,
So that's my one question for you.
Janine, your comments raised a number of important and interesting points. One, I just want to build off of, respond to your comments about when we have dignitaries or delegates or representatives of various kinds traveling abroad. It's really interesting. We don't have a monarchy here. We don't have an emperor or a Caesar who simply by edict, right, can declare national policy. That's an important part of our checks and balances. And so even if a president of the United States goes and visits a foreign nation, that president doesn't have the power to make a treaty. And there was a famous instance of this in our own history. Woodrow Wilson, at the end of World War I, went and made all these deals with other nations to form and be part of a League of Nations. But that's a treaty, and a treaty by our Constitution has to be approved by the United States Senate. And so he came home with this treaty, and the Senate said, no, we think that would be giving up our national sovereignty to this international body, and we're not going to do this. And so he learned a very difficult lesson there in the separation of power.
But that's an interesting example, in that what they're doing now is they're going abroad and saying, we're not making a treaty, we're making an executive agreement. Thus, right, I don't have to have the Senate approve this. And that's part of the sneaky thing that I'm talking about, because we lose justice if that's the case. Change the name, and then I don't have to have it approved.
Well, and as well as a nation like Ukraine has learned the hard way, a promise made by one president is not binding on the next president, right? That's just a promise.
That's when it's an executive agreement. That's when it's executive agreement. But anyway, go ahead, and I got you off track, so go back.
Yeah, let me get to the deeper part. As someone who, I've been studying the American founding for a long time, 30 years, and teaching it, writing about it, and you would be hard pressed to find anyone who's a bigger fan, a bigger supporter of the founders than I am. And yet, I'm going to level a critique, or at least note an interesting contradiction. Within the literature of the founding, on the one hand, many of the founders emphasized the importance of virtue often. They said Americans and the people they elect, they need to be good, moral, decent, virtuous people. They said this over and over. And at the same time, when they designed the Constitution, they were very clear the Constitution is designed for very non-virtuous, power-hungry, ambitious politicians. And Madison says, what we want to do is use that ambition, use that hunger for power to offset each of the other branches. We want members of the executive branch filled with power-hungry, jealous types, because that type won't let Congress go do things Congress isn't supposed to do, and vice versa. So the Constitution, one could say, is written from a very Machiavellian point of view. It takes a rather low view of human nature. Now, here's the rub, and here's where parties come in. And it's also interesting, the founders knew about parties. They understood what they were. They warned against them extensively, but they didn't really anticipate the rise of parties. And the architects of the Constitution, this is directly related to our checks and balances theme for today. The architects of our Constitution thought that the interests of those in government, or let me make this as clear as I can, the strongest interests of those in government would be attached to their branch of the government. So members of the House of Representatives would all have in common a loyalty to the House of Representatives. They would want the House of Representatives to be as strong as possible. And members of the judicial branch, justices on the Supreme Court, their common bond, their common loyalty would be the court, the judicial branch. And so they thought those loyalties could be used to check each other, right? All members of Congress, regardless if they have different, constituents or represent different states, they would all unite together to protect the power and interests of Congress against an executive branch or a judicial branch that's trying to invade the legislative space, and vice versa. That's not the case today. It's not true that all members of Congress, what's most important is they're united in their loyalty to Congress. I would argue the phenomenon that trumps everything else is party loyalty, right? So you have partisans, you have people who are loyal to the Republican Party in the legislative branch, in the executive branch, in the judicial branch. You have partisans who are loyal to the Democratic Party in all three branches, and they work together. What their common bond is their partisan loyalty rather than their institutional loyalty. I think that's the problem, is the checks and balances were designed with a view to institutional loyalties checking each other. And we don't have institutional loyalties today. We have party loyalties, partisan loyalties. And so it's a real question whether the checks and balances of the founders still applies.
And what happens to justice in that process? It seems
Right.
like justice gets lost in that process.
Right. In a way, you could say partisan loyalty, right? So, now it's just become common when a justice is nominated for the Supreme Court. How's the vote going to go? Everyone knows. Everyone knows, right? If it's
So as my daughter just said, I'm going to toss this to Tova. Sorry to interrupt. My daughter said that she just has confidence in the people, right? That it may not be going right there, but hopefully the people will right the ship. Okay, I'm going to toss this over to Tova. Okay, Tova, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, thanks so much for being on. So for my question, I wanted to take a little bit more of an international view of things. So obviously the US has our own conceptions of justice and system of checks and balances. But the world, since the founding, has sort of developed international standards of justice through different frameworks. And so, like, for instance, those set by like international law, human rights, that sort of thing. So I was wondering, how do these international conceptions of justice interact with those that govern us within the US?
That's a great question. Thank you. I'm going to say something that might sound a little jarring to some people. But the founders were classically educated. The founders were very well read in the Greeks and the Romans. And one of the ideas that they did borrow from classical thinkers was the idea that there is a common nature, and there is a human nature common to all human beings. And therefore, there is a kind of natural justice that is true for all human beings. And even if there are other cultures out there that reject natural justice or have a different conception, the founders, I think, would stand with an Aristotle and say they're wrong, they're incorrect. So when you look at our founding document, we've been talking about the Constitution and the Federalists, but before all of this is the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence does not present articles of faith. It does not present an 18th century American perspective on things. What it presents are self-evident truths about all human beings. And it says every human being possesses an inherent, unalienable, a natural right, not a legal right, not something that comes from a law or regulation or a bureaucrat or a lawmaker, a rightful claim by nature. Each person has a rightful claim to his or her own life, liberty, and the free pursuit of happiness. And they said that's true for all human beings. Now, we're going to create a specific government here in this specific place, the United States, and we're going to try to get our government to protect the natural rights of Americans. And what justice requires is that other governments should be doing the same. They should protect the natural rights of their citizens. And governments that don't do that, governments that hurt their own people, that steal from them or starve them or push them into death camps, those governments are objectively bad. Those governments are rightly called tyrannies, and they are unjust. And of course, there's a spectrum, right? It's not sort of either or, it's a whole spectrum. When you get into the realm of international human rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and these things, I would suggest what you find is a smattering, a mixture of actually just natural right principles, natural justice, the idea that the natural right to your own life, to your own liberty, to your own free speech, to your own property. You have a rightful claim to what rightfully belongs to you. And then they mix in with it a whole bunch of very modern, different modern economic rights. They add that to, they say, in addition to your right to your life and liberty and property and those things, you also have a right to free healthcare, and you have a right to free education, and you have a right to free housing. And then that raises all kinds of big questions, right? Well, if the whole world has a right to free housing, who's going to buy all the houses? Who's going to build all these houses? And so I think there's a contradiction within modern international notions of justice, that a contradiction that one does not find in the American founding. And I think it's because the founders they thought very clearly about these things because of their education. They said we have a natural right to each person to his or her own life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and stopped, right? I don't have a right to make someone else provide an education for me or to provide healthcare for me or anything like that, according to the principles of the founding. And I would say that's right. So there's a conflict there between the American notion of justice that comes out of the literature, including the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, and international standards today. And I would suggest to you that the view of the American founding was more correct than international standards today.
Wow, yeah, thank you. That's a great perspective that I think is a very valuable addition to the conversation. And then I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the role of public influence on the judicial system and checks and balances. So, what role do you think public opinion ends up playing in shaping decisions of political and judicial institutions? And where does that tension come from?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it I think it varies throughout the course of the history of the court. There have been times where the court seems to bow more toward public opinion, toward what's going on in the realm of current events and what seems popular at the moment. There are other times when the court seems to stand athwart what's very popular. I'll give you a very clear example of that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was first elected in 1932. He assumed office in 1933, and he came in having promised in his campaign a what he called a New Deal. And this New Deal would include the creation of all kinds of federal regulatory agencies that would go out and regulate entire industries and tell them what they're going to make and how much they're going to make and what they're going to charge for it and how much they're going to pay employees and all these details of how business would be run. He also campaigned on the idea. Remember, this is during the Great Depression. A lot of people were out of jobs and they were losing their homes and terrible things were happening. He said, we're going to have federal relief programs. We're going to make sure that the federal government supplies food and money and other resources to people that need them. And that was popular. Popular opinion. There's no question about this. Popular opinion was on the side of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. I mean, This guy got elected not twice, not thrice, but 4 times in a row by huge majorities. And the first few years when he was in office, the Supreme Court kept striking down one program after another, saying, look, this is unconstitutional. We have a constitutional republic, and Congress only has the power that we, the people, delegated to Congress. And we, the people, never gave Congress any power to go tell businesses how much product they have to produce, or how much they have to pay employees, or how much they can charge for their, whatever it is, the services that they're offering. That's unconstitutional. You don't have the power, the constitutional authority to do that. And they kept striking it down. That all changes in the course of the 1930s. And eventually the Supreme Court, many scholars joke and call this the switch in time that saved 9, because there were 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And after Roosevelt got reelected the second time in 1936, by that point, he was sick and tired of the Supreme Court. He said, this is ridiculous. We keep creating all these New Deal programs, and these crusty old constitutionalists on the court keep striking them down. Enough of this. Let's just pack the court. Let's add a bunch of judges to the court. The Constitution does not specify how many judges sit on the Supreme Court. It just says there will be a Supreme Court, and Congress gets to decide by law how many judges. At that time, there were 9, and a majority of them were constitutionalists. And his proposal was, let's create 15 or 20 new seats and fill them with our New Deal friends who will uphold all these New Deal programs and policies. And voila, almost instantly, the Supreme Court starts to approve all of these New Deal programs. And for the most part, it has been ever since. So there's an instance where the court went from standing athwart public opinion, saying, we don't care what's popular, we're going to uphold the Constitution, to the opposite of, we're going to do what the people want done, and we'll make up constitutional justifications for our decisions as we go along.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a great point and a great example. And it kind of brings me to my last question, which is if you could discuss the tension between the principle of judicial independence, but also the need for accountability within the judiciary, and how this tension impacts the pursuit of justice. Like, how do you maintain judicial independence while also having a system of checks and balances where the judicial branch is accountable to the other branches?
Yeah. So I'm gonna weave back in one of my favorite books, the Federalist Papers, here as a guide. I've been challenging students for 25 years to make sense of Federalist number 78. This is the one where the Federalist defends the idea of judicial review. And for those in the audience unfamiliar, judicial review is the act by which a court strikes down or declares unconstitutional a law. Now, when you think about that, right, if you step back just for a moment, that's a really unpopular thing to do. That's a very, in fact, let me use a phrase that's popular today. That's a very undemocratic thing to do. The people elect members of Congress, and they elect a president, and that Congress passes a bill, and the president signs it, right? It becomes law. Who are these unelected judges to come in and declare this to be unconstitutional, to strike down or declare it to be null? That's a very independent court that would do that, right? That's a court that's not dependent on the other branches, not dependent on public opinion. And what I've been challenging students is to go through Federal 78 and parse out, dissect the argument and see if it's compelling. And I sort of tip my hand. I don't think it is. I don't think the argument is within that one essay. I don't think Hamilton makes the case why the court should have this power. And let's be clear here. We're talking about the Constitution. The Constitution does not explicitly give power to the Supreme Court to declare a law unconstitutional. It doesn't. The authors of the Federalists argue that that power is inherent in a written constitution, that if we write down a constitution and we say, you people in Congress, here are your few powers. Here's what you can do. We've delegated these powers. Article 1, Section 8, there's 17 of them. It's a pretty short list. And then Congress goes and does something else. They go and they pass some other bill that they weren't authorized to do. Hamilton makes the argument, it's incumbent upon the court. The court has the obligation to declare that's unconstitutional. They didn't have the power to do that. And I think that argument for judicial independence can be defended adequately only on the premise that the Constitution itself is wisely designed, is a good Constitution, is a just Constitution. If you start with that premise and you can explain it, you can explain why the Constitution is good and wisely designed and just, then you can argue the conclusion that laws that violate the Constitution should be declared unconstitutional, should be struck down. But if the original Constitution, there are critics out there. This should be news to nobody here. There are critics, there have been for a long time, who say that our Constitution is racist, that it's immoral, that it's outdated, that was written for a world a long time ago and is no longer relevant. If all those things are true, if our Constitution is really bad, if the Constitution is unjust, then wouldn't we want laws that depart from the Constitution, right? Wouldn't, by definition, if the Constitution is unjust, then wouldn't unconstitutional laws be just, right? And so it really depends on the character of the Constitution, which is why more than ever, we need ordinary citizens to become more familiar with their Constitution so that they can judge for themselves whether they think the Constitution is good and wisely designed and just or not. We really need a kind of a constitutional culture here in the United States. And that begins with
Dr. Krannawitter, thank you so much. We're going to go on to Jewel and Jorn because we have about 13 minutes left and we want to make sure they get in and we get to some audience questions.
Sure.
So if we could, Jewel and Jorn, I'm going to turn it over to y'all.
All right. Thank you. Been learning a whole bunch over here. So we're going to ask, first of all, our checks and balances were pretty carefully orchestrated. It's a symphony in the Constitution. One of the interesting powers is that the House has the power of the purse, as I like to say. So I'm wondering, why is it almost a political faux pas for them to exercise that over branch of the government, regulative state, these different entities? We don't really see the House exercise that power often. So they forfeited that check. And has it always been like that? When did it get like that? Why is it like that? Do you think that that's an important part of our checks and balances?
It's a great question. I'm going to answer it in two parts. So I'm going to take a little stretch here for the first part. And that is just to compare the House and the Senate very briefly. One of the most important checks in the original Constitution that almost no one talks about today was the United States Senate. Because remember, the national government and Congress in particular only has a few powers that they're delegated. All the other reserve powers are reserved to the states. States are where things like criminal codes and civil courts and civil law, all that should take place at the state level. And the question was, how are we going to ensure that the national government stays within its little confines and doesn't start stepping on the toes of the states? And the answer was the Senate. Because under the original Constitution, state legislatures selected senators. Senators were not popularly voted. They were selected by state legislators, and those state legislators were very jealous of their own power. They would hold, right? If Congress was doing things that the states should be doing, should be reserved to the states, the state legislators would call those senators in and say, hey, what are you doing? That's not your turf. You're stepping on our turf. All right. And they would boot those people out and replace them with people who were respectful of rightful state power. Now, the power of the purse in the house, and this is an entire graduate seminar right here. There's another thing the founders did not anticipate. They did not anticipate the rise of a large, sprawling, expensive administrative state. All of these hundreds, I've written a book about this subject, the hundreds and thousands of bureaus, offices, agencies, right, all housed within 15 departments of the federal government. There are today, and I'm not talking about the military, set the military aside. There are approximately 3 million unelected bureaucrats working for the federal government. And this is a huge, huge piece of the funding. And the reason the political class in Congress, you know why they love that big bureaucracy? Because they can put blame on the bureaucracy. They can put blame over there. We had a great example out here in Colorado. The EPA came out and polluted an entire river. They were working on a big mine. This is about, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. You can Google it and find it. They turned an entire long river, hundreds of miles of a river, bright yellow. And the politicians, including our own politicians from Colorado, the very next morning, there they are on TV and they're puffing up their chests and they say, we're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to have hearings and we're going to call in members of the EPA and, get to the bottom of this. And in the end, nobody was fired. Nobody was demoted. No one even got a pay cut or anything. It's all those agencies serve as ways for politicians to deflect responsibility. Say, I'm just a senator or a representative. It's that agency over there that's in charge of this. Let me go find out what's going on. And then all of a sudden you feel thankful, right? When there's a problem with government and I say, I'll go find out what's going on over there. And so the funding for these agencies now has become almost automatic. They fund above whatever last year's budget was because all elected, this is a bipartisan phenomenon. Republicans, Democrats, independents, every elected politician loves having all those bureaucratic agencies because it's a way for the politician to escape responsibility.
All right, John's got a
Thank you.
question. Thanks.
You kind of skirted along this a little bit, but do you think that states are doing enough constitutionally now to check the federal government?
No, but it's that is a thorny question. How much states could do without inviting some kind of serious conflict. And we do now have, we even have conflicts in law. I live in the state of Colorado. Colorado was one of the first states. Now there are many, but it was one of the first states to legalize marijuana, decriminalize it, right? They said here in California, it is not a violation of criminal law to own, possess, sell marijuana, but it is a violation of federal law. So we have, one of the things I do training for county sheriff's departments. And this is a problem. You get, someone calls up his friend, the sheriff. He says, Sheriff, I have the DEA is tearing my house apart right now. They have a search warrant, a federal search warrant, but I have not violated any state laws at all. Get over here and do something. And the problem, right, is we have contradictory laws. State laws now contradict national laws. What's the sheriff? One of the questions I ask when I do this training for sheriffs, I ask them, what would you do if you show up and it's a friend of yours? He helped you get elected sheriff, and you show up at his house, and sure enough, there's a dozen DEA agents and they're tearing everything apart. Would you arrest the DEA? Would the DEA let you arrest them? Right? Are you at that point as a sheriff? Are you picking a fight with the entire federal government? And that conflict has come because the federal government has issued laws and regulations that it was never supposed to. Things like drug laws was always supposed to be at the state and local level. There was never supposed to be a conflict between states and the federal government. because these are supposed to be, these separate orbits. And instead we have a federal government that increasingly passes laws and regulations about things that should be handled locally at the state level.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Happy for some audience questions.
Yeah, and we'll try to get to several audience questions. We also want to thank Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM for airing our program on Mondays at 6 p.m. So thank you to our listeners in Las Vegas on KKVV. We also want to give a shout out to some teachers and students that are watching with us today. Cherie Stiegel has students watching. Dina Patzloff has students at Central Union Adult School watching. Hope Mucklow has students watching. Alexander Tokarov and Cami Wainhouse all have students watching. So welcome to all of our teachers and students today. So Dr. Krannawitter, if we could try to keep our answers fairly short so we can get to a few audience questions. Brad Hasten asks, were the founders more interested in classical republicanism that focused on virtue, or in liberal republicanism that places the focus on private pursuits?
Wow, fantastic question. Both. The answer is both. What the Americans attempted to do, and we can sort of judge whether they were successful, is a kind of hybrid, is bringing in elements of classical Republican thought. There's a defensive virtue in the founding, with very modern liberal, as in Lockean liberalism, a kind of liberal commercial republic. They thought they could form there's really something new. What the regime that came out of the American founding, I would argue, was unprecedented. There's no model for it in the history of political thought or political regimes.
Well, thank you. And then Sandy Thatcher asks, what are the checks and balances that limit and control how the federal military can be used in execution of government policy? In other words, the military cannot be used by the president to punish his political enemies and repress the right of the people to protest his policies. What distinguishes the U.S. from countries, say, in Latin America, is that the military has not been politicized and used to repress the populace and enhance executive power. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, a few. I know we're limited for time here. A few key things. Number one, civilian control of the military, right? Our president is a civilian. He's elected by the people. He's part of the civil government. And yet the president is commander in chief of that. In itself is a big check, because if the president is doing things we, the people, don't like with the military, we have the power to elect someone else in the next election. And if it can't wait, we can order our members of Congress to impeach a president. So those are big checks. Also within the Constitution, the commander in chief power is granted to the president, whereas the power to declare war is granted to Congress. The power to provide for an army and a navy is granted to Congress. The power to fund those things is granted to Congress. So Congress acts like an important check. If the president is sending the military out on unjust expeditions of conquest, Congress can just dry up the funding. So there's not going to be any money there to buy gasoline for your planes and ships and things like that.
Well, thank you. And one of our longtime friends of Constituting America, Nan Nickel, writes in saying that she believes the audience of Constituting America is very well informed, and that this is one of the best segments that she has watched. So thank you very much for Dr. Krannawitter for that, and to Nan. And the last question here that I think that we've got time for comes from Eve Nichols. How do you feel additional parties will affect our country on the whole? Eve says a new party has just been accepted here in Colorado.
Yeah, I think the very nature. Actually, I'll suggest a little piece of obscure political science literature. My professor, my mentor, Harry Jaffa, wrote a sort of famous piece 60 years ago on the two-party system here. It gave rise to a whole body of scholarship on the party system. And he made the argument that the very nature of our elections being decided by simple majorities, 50% plus one, is going to incentivize two main parties. That is, a party that's currently in control that wins an election, gets 50% plus one, And then whoever's dissatisfied with that, what are they going to do? They're going to form a coalition, an opposing party, to try to become the new majority. The chance of third parties, being a controlling, decisive factor, I think is almost impossible as long as we stay under our current constitutional structure. I think it's very likely that we're going to have, even when the Republican Party replaced the old Whig Party, it's not like we went to a 3 or 4 party system. It was one major party eclipsing, right? As the old Whig Party disintegrated and went away, we got a new major, right? We still had 2 parties. Instead of Democrats and Whigs, it became Democrats and Republicans. And I think that's very likely to remain for the foreseeable future.
Well, thank you. And we're right at the top of the hour. I hope Mucklow just wrote in as well and said, yes, this episode was so informative and one of the best. So Dr. Krannawitter, thank you so much for your time and for being with us today. And thank you to the audience and to our panel and all the great questions. And don't forget, everyone, sign up Friday right on the front page of our website and drop in and out or stay all day for our Friday, September 15th Constitution Day program. And we look forward to seeing y'all next week, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So thank you.